Hi, and welcome back, Plant Medicine Yogis. I hope you had a nice wetting of your palate as you entered into this world of self-realization and yogi traditions. We just barely got started. So if you are joining, this is part 2 of a multiple series of diving into the Patanjali's work of the Ashtanga practices for self-realization with a slant into the plant medicine world, and how does that incorporate into our post-integrative work after medicine journeys. So with where we've been, just a little recap, we went over what this class was going to be about, what it wasn't going to be about, and just some basic understanding of what yoga is conceptually for most people, and then what it really is, and then in a broader context. And then the other piece is also understanding the basic tenets of the overall yoga concepts that stems from an ancient language in Sanskrit. So we talked a little bit about what Sanskrit is in a much more vibrational and energetic component. And now we're going to dive into the more meat and potatoes of the ancient text we've been talking about, the Yoga Sutras. So let me begin again by sharing the presentation, which you also have access to. And we start with the first 3 sutras, which again, if you remember, sutras are just these little 3-sentence or so. It's kind of like a haiku poem, if you remember those. It's basically a little nugget of information, and these are broken down. That's how this whole thing is written. And remember, there's like 195, 96 of these. And so we're going to take just the first 3. Now, I also want to bring attention to the word Ashtanga. We'll go into that as well. Ashta means 8, and then it's the Anga part, which is talking about a limb or petal. So it's how you view it. It's the 8 limbs, most commonly known. It could also be 8 petals. So I love this quote, similar to a different quote by Lao Tse, because it's also similar in that when the student is ready, the teacher appears. It's kind of similar to that. But in this case, this is one of the interpretations of one of the sutras. It's the discourse starts now for the student that is ready. So again, this material is not for everybody. It's kind of for a more mature audience that is well into their healing journey and that has actually come up into past the awareness phase. We'll talk about that too in some of the future slides of where you might be on your path towards self-realization or healing. And of course, becoming aware is usually always the first step. And so maybe some of you are further along that path. So it really says that when the student is ready, these types of principles, this work, this type of information is going to be something that you are interested in or seeking. So let's go into these first 3 sutras. And so you get a feel for how this is written and how there could be so much interpretation that can be built into such a small phrase or sentence. So again, in every book that you pick up that has the sutras, it'll give you the Sanskrit and what that looks like. It will then give you the phonetic pronunciation and then the English translation. And again, you know now that the translation is going to be different depending on which book you pick up, because it's just so hard to precisely translate what it's saying. And then again, the other thing to keep in mind is to remember that all of these are usually chanted or sang in a particular way. So again, if you take a look at the very first one, if you just read it, it would say Atha Yoga Anusanam. And then I've learned it. My yoga teacher actually is a chanter, so she would say Atha Yoga Anusanam. So that's kind of how you would hear it, and they would keep going. The chant kind of puts together the words. And that's what makes it hard when I started to learn how to kind of do this. The words are just kind of smushed together, and you just keep singing as though there's no spaces in between the words. And what does it say in our best translation in English? And now the teaching or discipline of yoga begins. I feel like there's a very big power statement here, right? If you can just hear into the words and the vibration of that statement, it almost feels like a mic drop at the end when we haven't even got, this is just the beginning. We haven't even gotten anywhere, right? And it's almost like boom, right? And now the teaching or discipline of yoga begins. To me, that means the vibration of that means, okay, you've played around with a bunch of other things. You've gone up this alley, that alley, you've tried this, you've tried that. Now that you're ready, here's the real, information. Here's the real knowledge. That's kind of the feeling I'm getting from this. And now, here you are to the real deal. That was 1.1 of the sutras. 1.2, yogas, chitta, vritti, naroda. Okay, the C kind of sounds like in Italian where it's more of a CH sound. Yoga is the cessation of the fluctuations of the mind. So very simple, akin to, again, mindfulness, which not going to, throw it away. It's very, 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 very meaningful. In fact, that's where I got my start in learning to quiet my mind. But that's the tenets, right, of any mindfulness practice, the cessation of the fluctuations of the mind. And again, it's not telling you yoga as in the asana practice, which is the postures, or the this practice, or the that, or the pranayama, or the, it's saying in its totality, it is the cessation of the fluctuations of the mind, nothing to do with the body, right? But through all these other practices, we might enter in through the body to arrive at that cessation of the fluctuations of the mind, which is why they always say in a physical practice that the shavasana period, which is that resting, the death pose at the end where you lay on the ground, is the most important part of the yoga practice, because that's where you arrive at this, hopefully, cessation of the fluctuations of the mind, because you worked out the body enough to where it's tired and the mind settles. So that's the goal. 1.3 is tada drashtu svarupe avastanam. Then the seer, so the self, rests in its own essential nature. So what's the point of arriving at the mind, at a calm mind? What is that? What is the point of going through all these practices, whatever they all are, to arrive at this calm mind for what? And it's telling you right here, so that then you, as the seer, or as Eckhart Tolle would say, the observer, can rest in its own essential nature. So this is this is who you really are. That moment of, some call it bliss, some call it peace, some call it equanimity. But basically that which lies behind the scenes, that's just operating there, just hovering there, doing really nothing, just existing and being. Again, many of us can think of the Bufo experience. That's where I feel like just very directly you feel that dissolution of the body and the mind. And what's left behind is your essential nature. A lot of people have been called, a lot of people have called this state very, very many different things, right? The soul, the higher self, source, any of that, one consciousness. So these three first sutras come out swinging. And it comes out saying, basically, so now that you've been there, done that, sought this, sought that, now you're here. You found your way here. Good. Now let the yoga begin. And with that, you're going to learn how to have control over your mind, your body, so that you have no fluctuations or very few. Well, no, this one is a cessation, so none in your mind, in order to find who you really are. Wow, right? What an incredible text. This is the first opening padas, which are the opening pada, which is the chapter. And these are the first three. Lots to process there. It could be very, very simple, but also very, very deep and wide. And you can see how many of the world traditions, religions included, health and wellness practices, stem from here, stem from these concepts of quieting the mind in order to find out who you really are in an experiential way, not in a read or observed, in a direct experience way, which plant medicines very often lead us to. But then we're left wondering, well, what was that? What did I just experience? How did I get there? And how can I get back, right? So let's continue on. That is basically now your first introduction into the actual sutras. Now, I mentioned padas, and pada is the Sanskrit word for foot. In this case, we are calling those the chapters in American English. So the 4 padas, so the entirety of the 195, 196 sutras are comprised into 4 different chapters. And we, in this masterclass, are actually only covering a teeny tiny bit of this material from the first pada, the first chapter, and the second pada, okay? Let's go into those 2. The first one is the Samadhi pada that contains, of course, the 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3, which we just went through right now. And this particular chapter talks specifically about developing the strength of concentration, leading to meditation. And we're going to break these down because, believe it or not, there's so much material there to understand the different nuances of what all that means. So Samadhi pada, and then Sadhana pada is the practice, the actual practice and the discipline. And that is going to be gone into very in depth in the next presentation. So for this one, we're going to concentrate in the Samadhi pada. In the next one, we'll go into the Sadhana pada, which goes into, again, the practice and discipline. Now, the next 2, if you guys really, really like this, we can dive into the next 2 padas. It gets kind of Harry Potter-ish. And what I mean by that is, if you have still not read the autobiography of a yogi, and if you know me, you've probably heard me talk about this book. I think that's a fantastic place to start. I would not, my own personal recommendation, start with the Yoga Sutras. You're going to have enough with what we've covered here today. And maybe if you're really, really, really interested, like, oh, I want to learn more, I would go into the autobiography of a yogi first. And that's the book written by Paramahansa Yogananda. And that's his story of coming to the US in the 20s and 30s and bringing this information for the first time to the West. Actually following Swami Vivekananda, who came just before him to like an international religious congress, and he showed up representing, Hindu tradition. But following that, Yogananda wrote this incredible book that the whole first part of the book, when you read it, you're kind of thinking, is this a fictional story? It has so much that you're kind of like, hey, this sounds like magic a little bit. It sounds like very, like I said, Harry Potter-ish. And that's because then you have this other book of the sutras that's actually not related at all, right? Not related at all to the autobiography of a yogi, but yet tells you the how. Again, this is a how-to book, okay? The other one's more of a what. This is a how-to. The autobiography of Yogi talks about concepts like bilocation. That means that you can be in two places at once. It also, of course, the one most commonly known talks about levitation, right? And you might think, okay, now this is getting into that very mystical, magical place. Well, the sutras actually talk about it in a very scientific way. Okay, they're constantly saying science and this is like one and the same. It talks a lot about how you can develop what is known as CDs. These are known as powers, right? So they're saying the more you learn to control your mind, your body, you're gonna learn to control the environment, nature, cells, all of that. It's a huge leap, right? To come from, hey, I just want to learn to meditate. And then they're talking about, yeah, and when you learn to do that, just wait a second, because you might start developing, the power to see with your inner eye, the power to know, the power, and it's all part of that intuition, right? You just really strengthen that intuition. It gets into all of these amazing places. So Vibhuti-pada, which is the third chapter, talks about those powers and manifestation. Have you ever heard of The Secret? Have you ever heard of this material? I kind of think, yeah, they're talking about what was in the sutras written thousands of years ago, made into today's material. But really, they're talking about the same things. How do you develop these CDs, and how do you use those to create your environment and actually have some control over it? The last of the padas is even wilder than that, not so much in what you can do, but the level of absolute liberation. That's what it's about. Absolute liberation of the soul and freedom, entire freedom. This is so complex. I sit with these concepts and then toy around with, oh my goodness, what does all this mean? It's so incredible how far and wide it goes. It's almost like in your medicine journey, never ever ask the question, this is tongue in cheek, of course, of, how does the universe work? Because I was silly enough to ask that in one of my journeys. And then it was all, Dali paintings, and my mind was bending in such ways that it was painful. And I said, stop. After a while, I couldn't take it anymore. And they're like, well, didn't you ask how the universe works? Being shown all kinds of stuff that was interesting. So similar to that, this last chapter is very overwhelming. So all this to say is we don't need to concentrate on all of that, but know that that's what's also included in this book. So that's why it's kind of incredible, magical, amazing. And how funny that, very little do we know about it, but maybe all these other books that are more well known to us, Joe Dispenza's work, all of that, basically piggyback off of this ancient knowledge. So just for you to know. And if you are interested, I'd love to hear if you even have an interest in exploring any of these later chapters. So let's go into the actual 8 limbs of yoga that we've been talking about. So again, the 8 limbs here, Ashta means 8, and then Anga means either limbs or petals, however you want to say or look at that. And then let's take a look at this tree. I love the analogy of the tree, reminds me of the tree of life. There's a beautiful journey I had. It was all kind of yoga infused. And I actually was so overtaken by this incredible experience where I actually was sitting at the base of the tree by the root. This tree didn't exist. It wasn't an actual tree. It was in my mind. But as I turned around, I looked up and out like as in a spiral, and it was this tree of life. And hanging off of the various limbs similar to this were all these yogis in meditative lotus pose. And I could see this incredible road, kind of like a path leading up to this tree in a very beautiful way. I also knew, yeah, that's not a way to go up, because then you don't come down from it. But it was a beautiful experience I had. later, now I'm putting all of this together. Wow, it's all kind of woven together. So we won't go into the specifics of what all this means. I want to give this all to you in bite-sized kind of pieces so it doesn't become tremendously overwhelming. But let's just kind of go over this tree, and then at the next lesson, let's take these and break them down. Specifically, what I really want to focus in on is the yamas and niyamas, because the yamas and niyamas are where it's at as far as what we're going to be focusing on for this kind of work. The yamas and niyamas are where we talk about the do's, the guidelines, the how-tos. That's where it's at for us. So here, very broadly, it's talking about external ethics, internal ethics, but really the yamas are the do's, the directives, and the guidelines. The niyamas are the how to cleanse and strengthen the body, how to build that discipline and that will. Now, this is where I want to talk about the uniqueness of this tree, okay? If you look at all these terms, you're like, what the heck does all that mean? Well, breaking it down really simply, asana is practice. So that's like any kind of body work. And I would put any kind of body work. I wouldn't even talk about yoga specifically. I mean, any kind of training that you do for your body would fit here, okay? And again, we'll talk about all of these in depth, but like for instance, pranayama is any kind of breath work. I would put, Wim Hof, breath work training. I would put holotropic breath work. I would put any kind of using the breath to change your level of connection to the body, but also to induce a non-ordinary state of consciousness. I would put any of that into pranayama, okay? Of course, dhyana means meditation. So I would put any kriya practices, any mindfulness meditation, I would put that all in here, okay? Anything that is sensory deprivation, like the salt chamber, where you float, the ice work, the temescal work, any of that where you're using your senses and you're trying to go beyond what you're feeling in the moment is pratyahara. And so samadhi, what I'm saying, okay, maybe others may or may not agree. This is my opinion. I believe plant medicine arrives you at samadhi. And in the sutras, in the Upanishads, in the ancient texts, the Vedas, they talk very much at length about a substance known as soma. Soma, we don't know what it is today. We just know it's a psychedelic, a plant medicine of some sort that came out of that region of the world, okay? Nobody's quite sure what it was, but if you read about it, it is extremely similar to ayahuasca, extremely similar, because of the way they talk about the very particular preparation of a brew, of a something you drink and you take. And there is a preparation for how you put it together and how you cook it and how you create it. Well, how you create the ultimate brew. So they talk about soma quite a bit in these ancient texts, and that this was your connection to the gods, and this was your connection with yourself, and this is how you learned, and this is how you explored, and this was one of these kind of limbs, was your soma practice, right? So to me, that was so beautiful, because that is what we're doing as plant medicine yogis, and it's dropping us off at the samadhi, some of them, right away, right off the bat. You come into samadhi when you go into body dissolution with most of these experiences. Now, you also go through a lot of these limbs when you're trying to achieve that level as well. When you're trying to go into the medicine, you start feeling all kinds of things in your extremities, in your body, and you're paying full attention to that one sensory experience. So you're in that pratyahara. You might use your pranayama, you might use your breath to work with your body to experience that breath, that one giant breath maybe coming back into your body, right? You experience dharana, which is the concentration that leads to something else. So we use all of these when we're doing plant medicine, but it arrives you at that samadhi experience of unified bliss, right? And we're going to go into these in depth. So I just wanted to give you that overview. But here's what I'm purporting too, is that you can have a very non-linear way of working or going about working through these limbs, right? So someday you have a rape, which I would put part of pranayama perhaps, or pratyahara, which is how to, control your sensory experience. So you have that kind of practice. Then you have a body work practice. Then you have, like a sauna practice or an ice bath practice. You have all of these different things that you're trying out. How do I get to samadhi and how do I stay? How do I get to stay there for longer periods? How can I do it through a body sensory experience, through a breathwork experience, through a soma or plant medicine experience? How do I get, and you're working the limbs of the tree, you're working the limbs of the tree, and you may have come to it through one of the limbs, but now you're trying a bunch of other limbs of this tree. It's a very non-linear path, and you may never have even thought about the yamas and niyamas that make up the root system of this tree. But that's because that's our modern world, right? You grew up never in school, or your parents, did they tell you, hey, make sure you practice you're this or you're that for your ultimate self-realization? That's just not part of our culture. Other places like in India, this may be a critical part. Maybe there's an ashram right next to your home and you run over there when you're 7 years old and you're learning how to control your mind and you're learning how to meditate, you're learning how to do all these things. But in reality, with our current world, you could have stumbled upon any one of these practices and then started to realize, oh, there's different avenues. Oh, I want to try this other thing. I want to try that thing. So in a very linear way, it would only be if you lived in that culture and that's what was fostered from childhood, from your parents' parents, and things like that. Then you would start really nicely learning the yamas and niyamas as a very young child and starting to practice and strengthen your practices throughout this tree and going in a very linear fashion. For us, we're trying to just find our way almost in reverse, right? Almost in how do I even perfect some of these, and then, oh wow, there's these tenets that I really need to be aware that actually support the growth and strength of this tree. And now the further thing that I'm also kind of suggesting is that I think that the whole goal of our lifetimes isn't perhaps to fully self-realize or to always achieve samadhi, but it is to find your way onto the tree, your tree. Okay, that you go through life with these experiences, normal, career pursuits, maybe the traditional outlets of alcohol, fun partying, et cetera, et cetera. All of these are paths that are off the tree. You're just going down, this kind of like 3D worldly experience in very little to no connection to the body, the mind, the spirit, practices, discipline, will, etc. Then all of a sudden you have either a life need, maybe a devastating loss, maybe a blow in your life. Something brings you to a practice that then opens you up. And then you're like, okay, where do I go from here? Which is the question that we started with. Well, you start experiencing any kind of branch of this tree, and then you realize, oh, wow, I like this, and there's so much more to this. I want to learn more. And that's where I think every mature human, every mature soul needs to get at somewhere at some point in their lifetimes. Because just walking aimlessly down a random path is just going to lead to more of the same, more of the same, more of the same. So until you find your way to this tree and start exploring the tree and eventually make your way down to the roots, you're going to understand the importance of living this kind of life, and why it's important for you, what's important for you, and just the incredible true happiness and fulfillment that you can achieve. And I'm not saying that you would have cupcakes and rainbows every day. It's still difficult to live here. It's still hard lessons in life, but this gives you the tools with which to look at life. And eventually, like the Buddha said, you know, be able to overcome suffering despite it not being a perfect or pretty world. Certainly right now, it's not, right? And so how can we still be fulfilled, loving, kind, compassionate, empathetic, and self-realized human beings in this type of environment? It is 100% possible, because throughout history, you know, there's been many other times of chaos, many other times of doom and gloom, and yet all of these ascended masters have come through the ages, right? So how did they do it? This is the how-to. This is that very plan, and we're going to go through all of these in depth, and more importantly, the yamas and niyamas, which are going to be the ones to lead the way as to how to sustain this tree. And then you can have as much fun exploring all of the different practices that support this internal growth of the soul and of the self. So I hope this leads you to a very fulfilled kind of thought process, where it's left kind of, you know, feeding some of that food for thought. And I really invite you back to take a deep dive into the yamas and niyamas. What are they? How do they apply to your life? And how does it sustain your practices of any kind that you're already doing in your life? So come on back to the next very exciting class for your plant medicine yogi path, and I'll see you back soon.